In a small Indiana town, a man once sat next to his bathtub for hours, watching a piece of wood float in the water. He wasn't relaxing, he was studying. That piece of wood would eventually become one of the most valuable fishing lures in American history. And the company built around it would arm anglers in 48 countries before disappearing almost without a trace. This is the story of Creek Chub. Let's go back to the beginning, to a small railroad town called Garrett, tucked into DeKalb County, Indiana. In 1906, three friends who loved fishing more than just about anything else started tinkering with an idea. Their names were Henry Dills, George Schulthess, and Carl Heinzerling. Dills was the dreamer and the tinkerer. Schulthess was already the town's mayor, serving 4 terms. Heinzerling ran a hardware business. Together, they made an unlikely trio, but they shared one obsession: catching more fish than anyone else in DeKalb County. Dills became consumed by a simple question: what if a wooden lure could actually move like a real, living fish? He spent his evenings whittling small blocks of wood into shapes, carving by hand, testing and failing, testing again. Neighbors would have seen him sitting beside his bathtub at home, dropping his creations into the water and watching how they wobbled, dove, and floated. When he wanted a real test, he hopped on his bicycle and rode out to Bixler Lake in nearby Kendallville to see how his lures performed where actual fish were waiting. It took 10 years of refining before the idea became a real business. In July of 1916, the local newspaper, the Garrett Clipper, ran a small announcement about a new company in town. There was even a mix-up. The first printing of the article got the name wrong. A week later, the paper corrected itself. The business was called the Creek Chub Bait Company, named after the small minnow that swam in the creeks surrounding Garrett, a fish that local bass loved to chase. The operation started about as humble as it gets. Work was done out of George Schulthess' house. The very first workforce consisted of just 2 women. Within 2 years, the company had grown to 6 employees. It was a kitchen table operation in the truest sense. 3 friends with day jobs who had let a hobby quietly take over their lives. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that even longtime collectors sometimes forget. The reason Creek Chub lures looked so lifelike wasn't an accident. Dills and his team developed an entirely new way of painting lures, one that created a delicate, scale-like finish on the wood. It was so effective, so convincing to a fish's eye, that the company patented the process. And to apply that intricate painting technique, they needed steady hands and careful eyes. So they hired women. This decision would define Creek Chub for decades. Dills believed that women had smaller, more dexterous hands, better suited to the painstaking detail work the lures required. As the company grew and eventually moved into a larger building on Randolph Street in Garrett, the workforce remained largely female, a notable fact for a manufacturing company in the early 20th century. By the time Indiana installed a historical marker honoring the company nearly a century later, that fact was front and center. Creek Chub had quietly become a pioneer for women in the workplace, decades before that idea had a name. The lure that started it all was called the Wiggler. Henry Dills filed the patent for it in 1915, and it was finally approved in September of 1920. A second patent for that signature scale finish followed in December of 1919. Together, those 2 patents became the backbone of the company's identity. The Wiggler is now widely regarded by historians as the very first crankbait, the ancestor of nearly every diving, wobbling lure you'd find at a sporting goods store today. Word spread fast. By the 1920s, the Garrett Clipper was reporting on shipments leaving town bound for Stockholm, for Finland, for Toronto, for Hawaii, which wasn't even a state yet, for Bombay, India. A small operation that had started beside a man's bathtub was now sending wooden fish across oceans. The company poured money into advertising, spending tens of thousands of dollars a year, an enormous sum at the time, to get their lures in front of fishermen everywhere. Their mailing list eventually grew to 75,000 names, and the lures themselves became more elaborate over the years. Some had glass eyes. Some featured bristly tails or jointed bodies that gave them an even more realistic swimming action. By the time a finished lure was ready to ship, it had often been coated as many as 14 or 15 times with primer, paint, and lacquer, until the finish looked less like wood and more like something alive. By the mid-1930s, Creek Chub was shipping to 48 foreign countries and held more than 30 patents. The little hardware store owner, the small-town mayor, and the man who used to sit by his bathtub had built one of the largest lure manufacturers in the country. Then came the war. World War II brought obstacles that nearly choked the business. Raw materials grew scarce. The War Production Board restricted how much metal the company could use for hardware like hooks and diving lips. Before the war, the company had reportedly employed upwards of 100 workers. By January of 1943, that number had dropped to just 30. The company survived by rationing its materials carefully, stretching out a roughly 6-month supply of metal for as long as it possibly could. There's a detail here that doesn't make it into most accounts. For most of its history, Creek Chub bought its fishing hooks from a company in Norway. When Germany occupied Norway during the war, that supply line vanished overnight. It wasn't until September of 1945, right after the war ended, that Creek Chub received its first shipment of Norwegian steel hooks in years. When the war finally ended, something remarkable happened. Orders that had piled up for years came flooding back in. The company put out new ads, once again looking for female employees to keep up with the demand. By late 1946, Creek Chub had outgrown its original Garrett factory and leased a hotel building in the nearby town of Ashley to use as a second production site. Business doubled between 1947 and 1948. Within 2 years, the backlog that had built up during the war was finally cleared. The post-war decades were Creek Chub's golden era. Some of its most beloved and most collected lures, the pikey minnow, the jointed pikey, the plunker, the darter, and the injured minnow, became staples in tackle boxes across America. The pikey, with its distinctive metal diving lip, would go on to become the company's single most recognizable lure of all time. But success can carry the seeds of its own undoing. As the fishing lure industry began shifting toward plastic in the 1950s and 1960s, Creek Chub adapted, entering the plastic bait market and developing new saltwater lures. Still, the world around them was changing fast, and the company that had built its name on hand-carved wood and hand-painted scales now found itself competing in a very different landscape. Eventually, the founding families made a difficult decision. As the industry pushed further into plastic lures, a shareholder named Leroy Schulthess, related to one of the company's 3 founders, recommended selling the business rather than gambling on the new technology alone. In 1978, the Creek Chub Bait Company was sold to the Lazy Ike Corporation. It seemed at the time like a reasonable move, a way to pass the torch while the company was still strong. It did not work out that way. Lazy Ike soon ran into serious financial trouble of its own, and the chain of ownership that followed brought instability that the once proud Garrett company could not survive. By the late 1970s, the factory doors in Garrett closed for good. A business that had begun with 2 women working out of a mayor's house and grown into a company that shipped to 48 countries came to a quiet end. But that wasn't really the end of the story. Today, in workshops, tackle boxes, and glass display cases across the country, Creek Chub lures are experiencing what local historians call the company's second life. Original Wigglers, the very first lure Henry Dills ever carved, now sell at auction for thousands of dollars. Collectors hunt for rare colors, original boxes, and early patent markings the way others hunt for vintage coins or classic cars. In 2017, more than a century after 3 friends started carving wood beside a creek in Indiana, the state finally gave Creek Chub its due. The Indiana Historical Bureau, working with the Garrett Historical Society and the National Fishing Lure Collectors Club, placed a historical marker right in the heart of Garrett. It honors not just a fishing lure company, but a small-town business that helped shape an entire industry and quietly opened doors for women in the workplace decades before anyone else thought to. The factory is gone now. The hotel building in Ashley that once doubled production is gone too. But somewhere out there, in a tackle box in someone's garage, or behind glass in a collector's cabinet, an old wooden peaky with chipped paint and a metal lip is still telling the story of the 3 friends from Garrett who just wanted to catch more fish than anybody else. If you enjoyed taking this trip back to Garrett, Indiana, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story of an American company that built something the world will never forget.